Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and organizers, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor to have this opportunity to speak with you. And I got to say that discussions so far this morning have been really beneficial and encouraging to see that that we're having sort of those deep discussions that many of us feared had gone on the wayside, given the current global geopolitical situation. Perhaps just before beginning, I'll just offer a couple of thoughts just on some of the things that we were discussing this morning. And I found it interesting, when we consider military adaptation, I think what's important is that, and I noticed this over the course of the discussions this morning, when we talk about military adaptation, but all the discussions this morning rapidly went much broader than just about the security nexus to climate change. And that, I think, is an indication of the fact that it's much bigger. And so when we talk about military adaptation in the face of climate change, I think we have to frame it within a whole of society effort and requirement, because the risks, opportunities, and solution spaces are whole of society. At least it is from my perspective. And then number two, when we talk about military adaptation again, it's also multifaceted. And so, there's the military aspect to it, to ensuring that we maintain our survivability and operational effectiveness in the face of some of the challenges presented by climate change. But it's also about making sure that our infrastructure is resilient, both on the military and civilian side. It's about the evolution of perhaps some of our roles to support our populations. And then it's even maybe about making sure that we're not contributing or reducing our contribution to climate change by procuring and fielding greener technologies. And so those are just a few maybe framing comments I just wanted to offer before I provide my remarks. And so, as mentioned before, I'm Tim Arsenault. I'm the Deputy Commander of our Canadian Joint Operations Command, or CJOC, as we call it. And perhaps just to give you a sense of our role and responsibilities here in Canada, just to give you a sense of the lens that we look at some of these challenges through, I'll just talk briefly about the headquarters. In short, CJOC really is in charge of managing all of the Canadian Armed Forces conventional operations globally. And so at home, CJOC has the responsibility to detect threats, deter adversaries, and if required, defend Canada. We are also responsible for the 24/7 aeronautical search and rescue enterprise in Canada, and in collaboration with our Coast Guard colleagues, as well as a force of last resort. We support federal and provincial and territorial responses to domestic emergencies, which include climate emergencies. Abroad, CJOC is responsible for planning, execution, the command and control and sustainment of Canadian Armed Forces deployed globally. So you'll be most familiar with our largest mission abroad in Latvia, as we support NATO's deterrence and defense measures, as well as our ongoing support to Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy as we continue to deploy upwards of 3 warships a year to the region and work with our allies and partners to reinforce the rules-based international order in that part of the world. And so put simply, CJOC's primary mission is to lead joint military operations nationally and globally to defend Canada, protect Canadians, and defend our national interests abroad alongside our most important allies and partners. Our core priorities are to defend Canada, to support the defense of the Euro-Atlantic region, and to support the Indo-Pacific strategy. And then the fourth priority is contingency operations, so support to global contingencies, which are broad-ranging operations depending on the situation, but could include non-combatant evacuation operations in support of our Global Affairs Canada colleagues. So in this context, CJOC must confront the various challenges and threats around the world, including at home, and that includes climate change on an ongoing basis. Needless to say, climate change, and we certainly feel it as well, is a defining defining challenge of our time. And I think discussions at this summit have thus far highlighted the alarming rates at which it's accelerating, that our planet is warming, ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising. And the most obvious impacts can be observed in extreme weather events such as floods and wildfires, but there are also less obvious second and third order effects that require attention, many of which were highlighted this morning, and I've heard a lot of it during the breakout session on Eastern Europe that I attended this morning as well. So the stable and predictable world in which Canada has thrived is under increasing strain. And the established rules of international relations, which include the respect for sovereignty, adherence to international law, and the foundational commitments to human rights have been challenged. And the accelerating pace of climate change will create new security challenges and magnify existing ones at home and around the world. As we continue to grapple with the threats posed by our adversaries, it is imperative that we continue to recognize and address climate-related security threats. And so, I think there was, in the public domain, there was a significant interest in climate change prior to 2022, and the destabilizing security situation around the world has detracted some attention away from that. But I think it's important for us to recenter things and to consider them as threats that are interrelated. Recognizing and understanding climate security threats are mandatory preconditions to help shape the strategic foresight required to predict future climate conditions, to develop strategies to deal with them, and to ensure that our militaries have the necessary tools and resilience required to achieve their missions in the future. And so this leads me to the topic that I've been asked to discuss. I know this morning we mentioned that we had some military folks in the room to kind of ground us in some of the operational and tactical realities of some of the challenges that are being presented by climate change. And so I will speak briefly to some of the challenges that we see across all 5 military domains, which are land, air, maritime, cyber, and space. I'll just preface this by saying that none of what I'm going to say is going to be surprising, and I think for the most part I'll be stating the obvious, but I think the objective is really just to kind of talk through some of the challenges that we're seeing here in Canada with a view to fostering further discussion in the breakout sessions and during breaks as well. As you're well aware, there's a great deal to discuss in these areas, and 20 minutes will barely skim the surface. But my intent is to simply offer thoughts on a few examples in each domain, with the view to fostering some reflections, and I expect that it should spark some reflection for most people here in the room. You will note that they're varied in terms of nature, and so some of them are very much threat-based in terms of some of the physical threats that are posed to some of our populations in Canada, effects on some military capabilities, even potentially pressures on tasking on the Canadian Armed Forces to tie this back to some of the points that General Scott was making earlier about using your force of last resort to deal with natural disasters. But I think the fact that the examples are kind of varied, it actually speaks to the point I made earlier about how it's impossible to look at any of these in isolation, and that all of these threats are interrelated. I will provide examples on how climate change is directly impacting the Canadian Armed Forces' readiness, and offer thoughts on operational challenges across these military domains from a Canadian perspective. And then to conclude, I'll ask a couple of open-ended questions, but they're pretty obvious ones. I'll front load them here. But number one is, how do we improve our resilience to withstand the effects of climate change? And then, if we talk about military adaptation, what exactly do we mean? Again, considering that it's multifaceted. Is it about resilience? Is it about the role, or is it about something else? Starting off with the land domain, in Canada we have what we call Operation Lentus, which is the Canadian Armed Forces contingency response to domestic emergencies, supporting requests for assistance from federal and provincial departments. Lentis has existed for over a decade and a half, and during this time we have seen significant increase in the demands of the Canadian Armed Forces. And General Scott mentioned an example from his time in the SGS. In 2023 was actually, from our own experience at CJOC, the busiest year for Operation Lentis, where we deployed over 2,200 military personnel for a period of 131 consecutive days over the course of the year, supporting evacuations, firefighting operations, and emergency logistics across 6 provinces and territories in the country. Currently, in this year alone, forest fires in several regions of the country mobilize us to evacuate multiple communities. To date, we have deployed 847 members over 115 days with high demand and low density equipment such as heavy lift helicopters, which affects our ability to support our core tasks. Since 2010, the Canadian Armed Forces operations in response to natural disasters have roughly doubled every 5 years, with more pronounced effects on the Arctic, while the overarching intent is to ensure that the Canadian Armed Forces is employed as a force of last resort. In many cases, civilian and provincial authorities simply lack the resources, personnel, or capabilities required to deal with extreme emergency situations. A good example is the aeromedical evacuation of a hospital that we conducted out of Yellowknife in 2023, or the evacuation of isolated communities in our far north here in Canada, where civilian aircraft have a hard time operating out of. While the Canadian Armed Forces will remain ready to assist Canadians when required, of course, these are demanding domestic operations that affect how we prioritize our human and equipment resources to deliver on our primary tasks, which are, as I mentioned earlier, to detect, deter, and defend in Canada. From the perspective of our land-centric troops, the increased risk of heat-related illnesses impacts our personnel's resilience, and we're seeing this in certain parts of the world more than others, but it's certainly something that needs to be taken into consideration. And as with many other nations, novel cooling solutions have been employed to increase individual endurance in extreme temperatures, but these require additional energy, which contribute to existing sustainment challenges. In a Canadian context, there are also important geographical realities in the north, such as coastal erosion, permafrost thaw, and increased storm activity that are not only an everyday reality for Canada's northern communities, but also directly impact the Canadian Armed Forces' ability to conduct operations. For example, our ability to project Canadian Armed Forces members in the Arctic during our Operation Nanook requires us to develop multiple contingency options to address challenges of deploying personnel and of sustaining them, as well as extreme weather patterns that continue to impact military and civilian infrastructure, necessitating the acquisition of a more resilient and hardened infrastructure that can withstand these extreme events, and frankly, that can withstand the thawing that's occurring, because some of the infrastructure was built on the permafrost, and the ground is becoming unstable beneath it. We've also seen the reduced availability of the ice roads that so many of our northern communities depend on, in addition to impacts on fishing and hunting practices caused by ice reduction, which affects the populations, but also is an important consideration for any military elements that are deploying to that region. These are not direct military challenges, but they are issues that highlight the growing operational pressures and the mosaic of complexities that climate change imposes on the land domain. Shifting to the air domain, significant shifts in environmental conditions leading to greater weather volatility and unpredictability intensify turbulence and higher frequency of extreme weather. These challenges require aircraft to operate in harsher conditions, complicating flight planning and increasing flight risk. In short, climate change can affect the physical performance of aircraft, the safety of equipment and infrastructure, and the planning for flight operations. And to use a tangible example, we have our Canadian Forces Station Alert, which is at the most northern part of Canada, that requires sustainment over the warm months with flights to resupply and fuel and other supplies. But it's becoming increasingly harder, and it takes us longer to get it done because we're forced to delay flights more often because of weather. This leads to effects on aircraft performance and reduction of the effectiveness of their sensors as well. In the Canadian context, extreme weather and natural disasters have also periodically increased the demand for military assistance under Operation Lentis. As I mentioned, the heavy lift helicopters, which are often employed to conduct evacuations or move firefighters and fire equipment, but it also implies lighter helicopters and fixed wing aircraft in support of disaster response operations. In 2025 alone, we've evacuated over 5,200 civilians from remote communities threatened by wildfires, in addition to the provision of other forms of airlift support to provincial and territorial authorities. In the maritime domain, Arctic is warming at 4 times the global average, opening the region to the world. As Arctic sea ice continues to recede, access to Canadian Arctic waters is increasing for both state and non-state actors. This growing accessibility is driving increased activity in fishing, resource extraction, and commercial shipping. In turn, this surge in maritime traffic elevates the risk of incidents and accidents, placing greater demands on our search and rescue apparatus, and complicating efforts to maintain effective domain awareness. And in addition to that, it offers more opportunity for adversaries to conduct operations in that region as well, which further reinforces the requirement for us to maintain that domain awareness. Other challenges in the maritime domain include loss of sea ice and sea level changes, which are leading to increased coastline exposure to tides and waves and surges. This puts land-based military and civilian infrastructure at risk. There are also potential impacts to our naval assets as rougher seas increase maintenance requirements and negatively affect sensors, especially in the north. There are opportunities. This year, His Majesty's Canadian ship Margaret Brooke played a role in supporting scientific research in Antarctica, demonstrating Canada's commitment to climate and environmental stewardship while acknowledging the importance of collaboration with other government departments and international partners in advancing our understanding of climate change impacts. This research will improve Canada's understanding of climate change impacts and will help inform policies and measures to enhance Canada's resilience. Our search and rescue enterprise spans both maritime and air domains, but I mention it because this 24/7 operation saves Canadian lives each and every single day. In fact, there's on average about 3 search and rescue missions on a daily basis here in Canada. We maintain aircraft on various readiness states across the country to respond to critical incidents while also operating the network of rescue coordination centers required across the country to deploy those aeronautical assets. Our air crews have already responded to 454 search and rescue taskings this year, and we're seeing a steady increase in search and rescue events, driven in part by the growing frequency and severity of extreme weather events, particularly in our oceans. In the cyber domain, state and non-state actors conduct cyber intrusions targeting critical infrastructure like power grids, satellites, and military networks critical to our ability to command and control our forces, and it's destabilizing. In addition, information operations distort facts, cause confusion, and erode societal trust. Our vulnerabilities as a nation in this new digital landscape, it's not so new anymore, but it still is in terms of our ability to operate within it and defend ourselves in the space. It's challenging as actors can easily target environmental monitoring systems or manipulate data, resulting in climate-related disinformation campaigns, and we must continue to monitor that threat very closely. And finally, in the space domain, space is an integral domain that underpins the satellites, cell phones, and communications infrastructure that Canadians use daily, as well as the military technological advantage that Canada and its allies and partners rely on for our defenses. Adversaries have developed counter-space weapons designed to undermine that advantage and threaten the connectivity that enables our economy and way of life. Maintaining our access to and securing the use of space is key to our collective defense, security, and prosperity. Climate change-related effects limit the potential value that space capabilities can add to our operations. Impacts of climate change on ground-based infrastructure that is critical to space operations can hinder the effectiveness of our space-based assets. Increased extreme weather can also affect space launches and sustainment operations, leading to the degradation and or disruption of space-based capabilities. This said, space can play a role in ensuring we keep track of the impact of climate change and enhance our climate understanding. And I think our Earth observation satellites equipped with sensors can monitor atmospheric conditions, ocean temperatures and ice coverage, and greenhouse gas concentrations, providing valuable data that I know that many of you in this room are probably way more familiar with than I am. In addition, consistent global coverage enables real-time tracking of phenomena like wildfire, storms, and droughts that can be used for planning, including in the military context. And so, to conclude, looking ahead, military forces will need to adapt to hotter temperatures, increasingly more challenging operating environments, and ever-increasing demands to assist civilian authorities during climate-related emergencies. Data-informed decision-making will be a key as we build new infrastructure, forecast wildfires, and adapt training programs and procure military equipment suited to evolving climate conditions. I've shared reflections on climate-related challenges across all 5 domains, but I'll conclude by emphasizing that climate change will increasingly pose strategic security threats and challenges. And these may manifest as flooding, wildfires, water scarcity, mass migration, and even armed conflict over essential resources, which is already occurring in some parts of the world, but is certainly not impossible going forward in the West. The Canadian Armed Forces will continue to work hard to ensure that we are well prepared to address them and to continue to deliver on our core missions. And in this context, we must continue to anticipate second and third order effects to ensure that our strategies are robust and forward-looking, and that the imperative to maintain combat-capable military forces to detect, deter, and defend against our adversaries is maintained, because that requirement has not been more compelling since the end of the Cold War. It is therefore imperative to strengthen civil resilience and preparedness to manage the challenges associated with climate change so that our armed forces can remain focused on core tasks while also building their resilience in the face of the challenges posed by climate change. And so once again, you know, the open-ended questions when we talk about military adaptation, in what way do we see that adaptation, and how do we see that adaptation occurring in the context of our whole of government, whole of society response to the security threats posed by climate change, but also, you know, the conventional military threats that we're currently facing at this time. The global security situation has not been this uncertain and unstable for decades, and so the imperative for our militaries, just to re-emphasize, to build the readiness required to detect, deter, and defend against threats remains an imperative. But that said, I think there's a recognition that our military forces will continue to be called upon to support our civilian populations in the face of natural disasters. We can't allow ourselves to ignore climate security issues, despite the overarching geostrategic security issues, because as mentioned earlier, they are threat multipliers, and they're interrelated. So in this context, military adaptation amounts to maintaining the ability to defend our nations despite climate change, while remaining ready to assist our populations with disaster response as a force of last resort. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.